In previous lessons, we've looked at the impacts of earthquakes and also how earthquakes can be managed. Today, we're going to apply both of those and look at the hazard management of a country. This is Nepal, which is an LIC in Asia. So where in the world is Nepal? Well, it's just in that area between China and India. And if we zoom in a little bit closer, we can see Kathmandu, which is the capital there. And this area here called Gorkha is actually where the earthquake in 2015 happened. This is a very, very mountainous region. This is where the Himalayas are, but it's also a country where they are very, very poor. So about 25% of the population live on less than $2 a day. So in this example of hazard management, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is the response afterwards and the long-term planning. In the actual Nepal earthquake, a lot of damage was done, as we can see in the picture, and 9,000 people died, roughly around that amount. We need to go know why so many people died, and partly it was because of poor preparation. And when I mean preparation, in this example, we're talking about the fact is there was rapid urbanization, and because of that, we have poorly built buildings. But why do we have such poorly built buildings? Well, the fundamental reason really behind that, some of it is politics, but the main reason is the fact is Nepal is a very, very poor country and therefore doesn't have the resources to be able to build buildings that are earthquake proof, and often builds buildings cheaply, which means that they collapse when an earthquake happens, as we can see in the picture. This goes on to this famous quote that says, earthquakes don't kill people, buildings do. And we could even extend that to say, earthquakes don't kill people, but poverty does. When people are poorer, they often live in poor buildings, and then therefore, when an earthquake happens, these poor buildings collapse and kill a lot of people. So the first thing I'm going to talk about in terms of hazard management for an earthquake in the Nepal example is something called remote sensing. This is where we are getting data and information about what's happened in the earthquake, but we're doing it from a distance. And this can be done using drones, but it can also be done using satellites. And it's really helpful in this response stage. So after the events happened, you can see it used in other stages, preparation and long-term planning, but I'm going to talk about it, how it's used in the response stage of the hazard management. So we can take a closer look at this satellite image that has been taken of Kathmandu after the earthquake. And we can see in this area that I've circled, which has got lots of these little squares, that these are examples of emergency shelters. People have had their homes destroyed, and what they've gone is they've gone and made their own tents and put them up in this open space away from collapsing buildings. We can also see this kind of murky area, and this is smoke from fires. This is where gas mains have broken, and then electricity has caused them to start into potential fires. Therefore, we can see that having a satellite image of a city can be really useful because it can show us the areas that are most damaged, and it can show us where people are most at need. And it can, so if we've got limited resources, like a country like Nepal has, we can make sure that those limited resources get to the areas that need them the most. So here we can see how drones are being used in hazard management. We can see that they can again be used to map the movements of people, but more importantly, they can actually be used to look at the structural damage, as we can see here, of a building without having to send anybody in to risk their own life. So we can do it remotely, see how bad the damage is, and maybe if it's too badly damaged, then don't send people in. They can also be used to help search and rescue teams by giving it kind of a bird's eye view. And they can also be used to see if transport routes are blocked and which roads we need to kind of open up to help operations. To just summarize that last clip, we can use drones in three ways: assessing damage to buildings without having to risk lives. We can also organize search and rescue teams, see where they need to go, maybe see stuff that we can't see from the ground. But it will also, more importantly, we can see which transport routes are blocked by the damage and we can then tell the emergency services to use the open road. We can see in that picture that the road's blocked, and so emergency services would help and go another way, and therefore be able to get people and all the supplies they need through. However, there are some problems with using satellites and drones, and we found them in the Nepal earthquake. Because Nepal is an LIC, it doesn't actually own a satellite that it can use. It had to rely on a satellite and images from the USA, but because of that, there was a 2-day delay in getting to them. This affects the management of the hazard because it essentially, if they can't get the images straight away, it delays the response of the emergency services. That means they can't save as much people, or they don't know how to use their resources effectively. With drones, we also have physical limitations. So they have a certain range of which they can go, and also they have a range in terms of battery life, and that means that they can't be used necessarily everywhere. They can only really give us a general picture, so it limits the use of the drones. The other thing for a country like Nepal, as we said, it's an LIC, drones are relatively expensive. They're kind of a luxury to have, and so Nepal had to rely on drones that were provided by charities, and this all meant, again, there was delay getting them to the front line. So this links back into that idea that they couldn't necessarily get them straight away and had to rely on outside sources to help them. So another important part of hazard management is risk mapping. This is an example of a risk map that has been made for landslides in the country of Nepal, with the red areas showing high risk of landslide and the yellow areas saying moderate and down to green, which is low. These are created through a process called GIS, and that's where GIS is Geographic Information Systems. It's where we use computers and take the data and make it into a way that we can present it geographically, often using maps. And we can actually use drones and satellites to help create a map like this. The way we do that is we'd get them to fly over and record patterns, and then, for example, where the high risk of landslides is. So you could do that by looking at a picture of a really steep landslide and thinking that that's going to be a higher risk than if it's flat ground. And then once that information's been collected, we can then put that information into a computer, and then that computer will be able to manipulate it and analyze it and create a pattern on a map. So using risk maps and using drones to help create those risk maps and satellites is really important stage of hazard management. So we need to know what kind of stages of the hazard management cycle these would be used in. Well, they could be used in the preparation stage, and they could be used in the preparation stage to see what areas are at risk, and can we make changes so we can stop those people and those areas being at high risk. We could also use it after the event, so in the appraisal and the long-term planning, we can see what areas were really badly affected, where was the biggest landslides in this case, and what changes do we need to make sure that that doesn't happen again. Next, we need to look at the aid that was given to Nepal, £330 million worth of it, and this is an important part of the response stage. This is what happens after the earthquake occurred, and LICs will often require a lot of support from other countries. Multiple nations would have given aid to help them with managing the hazard. Here we can see aid in action. This is where basic provisions like medical supplies, but also emergency shelters and food and blankets will be provided, and these are all to help the people most vulnerable and make sure that the long-term consequences of being homeless or injured do not cause them any more damage. So the aid provided by other countries for Nepal after the earthquake would have helped manage the hazard. It would have helped save lives. It would have helped prevent some of the longer-term effects. But there are also problems with the aid in Nepal. One of the first ones was corruption. Lots of the money that was given as aid actually was kind of taken by corrupt government officials, and this means it didn't go necessarily to the places it had to in terms of helping rebuild the country, so that you had nearly 500,000 homes that still needed to be rebuilt 2 years later. That shows you that the longer term effects of this were not able to be mitigated because of corruption. The next problem was that the airports in Nepal were all very small. This meant that the large planes that would be coming from these other countries helping with supplies wouldn't be able to land, and therefore it took a delay in getting really key aid supplies, but also emergency teams that would have been there to help mitigate the hazard. The next issue was that while there was lots of support, in fact, there was probably too many charities. There was 300 that turned up to help the Nepalese. And because of this, the supplies that were actually available were not getting distributed quickly enough because there was arguments about who should be doing it amongst these NGOs and charities. And finally, even when the supplies were on their way, there was issues with access. Because there were so many landslides, the Nepalese army couldn't get to the poorest people in the rural areas because of blocked roads. And this means that more of these people would have been affected by the disaster.